In honor of Black History Month, this is the inspiring story of three men who moved to Juniata County in the mid-1800s who overcame remarkable odds to achieve great success through their hard work, integrity, and indomitable spirit. John Jack Imes was born on New Year's Day, 1775, the son of an enslaved woman and a white master at an Imes plantation near Baltimore. Now, just which Imes was his father has been narrowed down to three men, but can likely never be proven definitively. But what is known, thanks to a recently discovered 1783 will of John Imes, is that he willed his Negro boy Jack and one Negro girl Hannah and her increase to his son John. Now, according to family tradition, ownership of Jack eventually went to John's brother William and to his wife Elizabeth Howard. In 1787, when Jack was 12, William and Elizabeth moved from the Baltimore area to near Hagerstown, and they took young Jack with them. 5 years later, they decided to move to Ohio and sold all of their slaves except for Jack, who was afforded the option of choosing his master. This kind of special treatment typically only happened when the slave child was a blood relative. Was Jack's father William? Was it William's brother John, and hence a possible namesake for young John Jack Imes? Or could it have even been their father John, who was technically his owner at birth? Fun side fact, Elder John's brother is the namesake of Imesville, Maryland. Nevertheless, young Jack was at a pivotal crossroad in his life, and he chose a master named Andrew Klein, and it was there that Jack was married and began having children. A few years later, he was sold to a man named Jacob Siebert, where he lived for the next 18 years, still married and having a total of at least 13 children before his wife died. Each of those children were sold, a commonplace but harsh reality that was faced by slaves. Several times I'll be referring to a Reverend Benjamin Imes, who was Jack's grandson. Reverend Imes wrote an oral history of the family, which will be quoted several times. Of his grandfather, Reverend Imes wrote, "Jack, as a slave, was a resolute boy, and at 17 years of age was a teamster on the high road in charge of one of the great 6-horse freight teams, which in those days crept along across the mountains from Baltimore to Wheeling and Pittsburgh. I often heard my father tell of his daddy's integrity and fidelity as a servant and foreman, accountable to his master for whatever trust was committed to him, but never with a crouching submission. He came out of the school of slavery, his older children having been sold from him in their tender years, never to be seen again by their parents. But he boasted that he had always been true to his trust. He had not been a cringing slave in spirit, but at the time a servant who prided in the fact that there was nothing to his discredit. This was the legacy handed down with pride to his children." Around 1815, a 40-year-old Jack married a young slave named Susanna Pindle. This second wife was half his age and was already set to be freed upon turning 21. But their first 2 children were born before she reached that age, thereby, under law, slaves. Jack was determined to somehow obtain their freedom so that he didn't have to suffer any more of his children being sold. Jack had been saving for 30 years in hopes of buying his own freedom. He made money at nights and on Sundays by making tools and raising produce. Then the family was redeemed by the husband, who paid $300 for his own freedom and the same for each of his slave children, having earned this money by his industry and ingenuity in handiwork. Maryland law required free blacks to carry certificates of freedom with them, which they could get by filing manumission papers. Jack's record, which notes his yellow complexion, large scar on the shin of his right leg, scar on the joint of his left wrist, and large bald spot on the top of his head, states that he gained his freedom by a man named David Nagel, so at some point he must have been sold to Nagel. It was the bargain made with this man that made everything else possible. On March 1st, 1818, the Jack Imes family was free, and they moved to Welsh Run, Pennsylvania, just south of Mercersburg in Franklin County. Jack and Susan, with sons William, John Jr., and newborn Samuel, made the trip across the state border, and 3 years later, their son David was born. Jack worked on different farms in the area where they lived along the Conococheague Creek, and his boys were bound out as apprentices to neighboring farms where they learned farming and made money to bring home to their parents. The third son of Jack and Susan was Samuel Imes. He married Sarah Moore in 1842. Through their acquaintances around the Mercersburg area, they met Juniata Countyan Robert McAllister, who had recently married a young Mercersburg girl the year before. Robert was looking for a good foreman to run his farm in McAllisterville, and Samuel was just the man for the job. So beginning in the 1840s, the Samuel Imes family moved to Juniata County, where they lived and worked on the McAllister farm. Their son, Reverend Imes, later remarked that this was a good move for several reasons, namely because Juniata County was known to pay their farmers more money, and the sentiment toward men of color was also more accepting in the new county. Meanwhile, back in Franklin County, David was taking the skills he learned at the farm of a strict German preacher and applying them at their farm back home. According to Reverend Imes, David was only sent to school enough to learn to read and write sufficiently to keep his accounts, though in very bad spelling. In 1840, David married a freed biracial slave named Adeline Braun, who reportedly descended from Thomas Jefferson's private secretary. She also had inherited $1,000, which her young husband put to good use, purchasing a 53-acre farm for $900. He greatly improved the farm using these particular agricultural methods, and then tragedy struck. In 1850, Adeline died after giving birth to their fifth child. Her final resting place is marked at the corner of a field near Martin's Mill Bridge. Then, a few years later, Jack's wife and the family matriarch, Susan, died. Now, the men had likely heard about how well Samuel was doing in Juniata County and decided to join him. In 1854, David sold that farm for $3,000, making a profit that was no doubt due to his impeccable farming methods. 1 month later, David bought land along the Tuscarora Creek, the first of many lucrative land transactions he would make in Juniata County. He moved his 5 children, widowed father, and a housekeeper named Hannah Green across the county line, where they put down roots that are still blooming today. Then, on Christmas Day that same year, David married Sarah Ann Wilson, a local woman who was also biracial. Together, they built up a large farmstead in Pleasant View, Beale Township. Although they were one of only a few black families in the county and undoubtedly faced some adversity, he continued his successful farming methods and amassed large tracts of land around the Tuscarora Valley. He became quite wealthy and was well respected within the community during a time when most of his peers were still subjected to slavery. When the clouds of the Civil War crossed the land, 2 sons from his previous marriage, plus a younger son of Jack's named Henry, and also one of Samuel's sons, served in the United States Colored Troops. Now, to best understand David's thoughts and feelings, it is more poignant to hear his own words describe his success amid such difficult obstacles. In 1869, David wrote a letter to Frederick Douglass. The original letter is in the Frederick Douglass Papers collection at the Library of Congress. One of the many remarkable things about this letter is that most of Frederick's papers before 1872 were destroyed when his New York home burned down. Somehow, David's letter, written 3 years prior, survived.
Pleasant View, Juniata County, Pennsylvania, March 29, 1869. Dear Sir, having been loaned a book on your narrations gave me an anxiety to try to know more of you, and if this letter finds you, I have no doubt you will answer it. Robert Gamble was to see us from Iowa this winter and said you had made a speech in their town, Washington, some 2 years ago, and it was the best oration he had ever heard by a colored man. He told me, David, you ought to try to become acquainted with him, as you are the best farmer colored man, and he is the best orator I have ever seen in my travels. I myself have traveled very little more than teaming to Baltimore and to Pittsburgh a few times in my young years from Welsh-run Franklin County, Pennsylvania, where I was raised. My father was a slave and is living with me yet, now 95 years old. He was born near Baltimore. His father was his master, so his mother told him. His master's name was William Imes, and he has the same name. One of the things that most interests me is to know the rest of the narrative on how you got to New York. And as slavery is now dead, we would be glad to hear that part of your adventure. As I said, I never traveled much, as I commenced farming in '43 when everything was very low, and seeing all the colored men that had been farming before in our neighborhood break up. I was determined to try my luck, but I took a different plan. They rented their land, and I bought mine. I paid $900 for 53 acres of land, and in 10 years, I sold it for $3,000. Then came to Juniata and bought 110 acres for $3,000, in 10 years selling for $5,000. In '58, I bought a tract of land from John Gray, 148 acres that I leave yet. I also bought a 270-acre farm up Tuscarora Creek, 10 miles from Mifflin Station on the Central Railroad. This farm I have improved and live comfortably, which cost me a good deal. My house is 2-story with basement. My barn has wagon shade with a corn crib, tool house, and blacksmith shop. In short, all the necessary buildings are here. I had thought this to be my last earthly home, but as times are so changing, I will wait the issue. When I came to this valley, there was very few colored people here, and all very poor except my brother. He came here in '42. He now owns 114 acres with good buildings, valued at $10,000. Since I came out here, there is some 15 or 20 families that are doing well, nearly all farming. It is said by travelers that we are the most enterprising farmers in the state. I would be ashamed to write such a letter to a stranger if it was not that you know how hard it is to accumulate where there is nothing to begin with, and where everything was as dark as night on behalf of the colored race. But thanks to him above, he has given us the key to knowledge. Whoever is found worthy will be able to open the book and find that the days of fugitive slave laws and Missouri compromises and Dred Scott decisions are things of the past. And the shedding of blood was their doom. It is a truth that cannot be denied that without the shedding of blood there is no remission of sin. God grant that there may be no more shedding of blood amongst the American people. The only encouragement I had in the days of continual night was the colored people trying to improve their condition. There is no healthier sign of improvement than to see any people trying to do right. A great many are trying to do the very best, and so long as they continue, we have nothing to fear. There is still lingering in the minds of our colored brethren a weakness that ought to be remedied. There is not respect enough for our women, and so long as any race of men can be tempted by lust for strange women, conceived prosperity cannot be great. We must respect our own wives and daughters and sisters if we want to be great people. Lust always genders to bondage. Oh, if I could go to every house of color and say to the father, respect your own wife more than any other woman on earth, for they will make you most happy and prosperous, and will make you an independent and virtuous people. no more go back into slavery, no more to have the curse of God upon us, but blessings without number will follow our race. I am the father of many children, all healthy and well, found all to be capable of retaining a good, ample supply of knowledge, and so far as they are old enough, have a good common English education. They are all industrious and doing well. I have always been careful to show a good example beginning at home, and it is swelling into large proportions. It indeed is remarkable what one man can do when he has a cultivated mind and is careful, honest, and pure in his motives. And as the good Lord has blessed me in times when all was so dark, I do trust him that he will still continue his blessings forever on all my offspring for all time to come. Respectfully, your friend, David Imes.
While we may never know if Frederick did reply, the fact that David's letter was saved, existing in this collection at the Library of Congress, among other correspondence with people like Ida B. Wells, Susan B. Anthony, and Grover Cleveland, is strong evidence that he likely did write a reply. 2 years after that letter was penned, Jack Imes died, having reached nearly 96 years old. He lived long enough to see the fruits of his labor thrive, making his struggle well worth the toil. David hired academia cabinet maker and undertaker Joseph Stuart Brown to make his father's coffin for $15. An obituary claimed that Jack had 26 children, 13 slave and 13 free. The ethics he instilled in his children, a legacy that thrives yet today, proves that Jack's was a life well lived indeed. In 1879, David was selected to serve as a grand juror. The Port Royal Times reported, "Mr. Imes is the first of his race that ever served as a juror in the courts of Juniata County. He is an honest, upright, intelligent citizen and is fully equipped to discharge the responsible duties of a grand juror. We congratulate Mr. Imes on having been called to serve his county in such an important capacity." David and Sarah had 9 children, in addition to the 5 that he had with his first wife. When he died in 1894, at the age of 73, his prolific, prosperous, self-made legacy was filled with strong principles, knowledgeable farming, and a hard work ethic that can be seen in his future generations who continue to keep Juniata County thriving still today. David provided each of them with a handsome start in this world's goods, in both real estate and cash value. According to a memoriam written at the time of his death, by industry, frugality, and wise management, he had provided a home for all his children and saw each of them comfortably fixed in life. He owned at various times, including all his purchases, more than 1,500 acres of land for which he paid nearly $30,000, equal to around $1 million today. He was a most excellent citizen, well-versed in the history of his county, and kept himself posted on current events. He was a very interesting and entertaining conversationalist. As for David's brother Samuel, he later bought a farm in Walker Township called the Free Spring Farm that he and his family farmed for 20 years. As their children got older, they all moved away to study or seek other fortunes. Only their son William stayed local. Having no help on the farm, Samuel and his wife bought a home across from their beloved Lost Creek Presbyterian Church, where they lived out their remaining days. Thanks to the bold deal their father made, David and Samuel were spared the horrors of slavery, but it wasn't without struggle. It took relentless focus and an enterprising spirit to, in David's words, accumulate when there was nothing to begin with. Reverend Imes said, "They had won the confidence and esteem of the people among whom they lived, so that the prejudices which annoyed them in the earlier years were forgotten. The Imes were inspirational and outstanding men who have earned their chapter in this county's history.